All right, welcome back, boys. Few things give you more joy than seeing people in, if you're not watching this on YouTube, you really should be, in sort of rugby-looking shirts. We're here with Charles McElwee. Always happy to have you on the podcast, Charles. Today, we've kind of got you in the wolf's den here with some of the top hardos in the Charles McElwee universe. But obviously, we've invited you here to talk a little bit about what's going on in Pennsylvania, which seems to be leading the headlines of most of the political press. So how does it feel? Are you sort of like a celebrity this time of year?
The pressure is on, right? So it's certainly my area of knowledge is essential right now, right? The Keystone.
Truly. Well, the last time you were with us at Charles McElwee, you pretty much nailed that primary on the Republican side. So we're hoping maybe you can help us sort out some of the questions that seem to be asked over and over again. So maybe you can spare like 10 minutes just to separate kind of fact from fiction.
Let's go for it.
Let's go for it. Okay. All right. So myth number one about the upcoming elections in Pennsylvania. True or false, wacko MAGA candidate Doug Mastriano is going to ruin this for everyone on the Republican side?
So your description of Mastriano, that's where we should start.
Let's start there. Let's do it.
MAGA candidate. I think Mastriano is a distinct candidate compared to the average MAGA candidate in Pennsylvania. He is running to the right of what worked among Trump-like candidates going back to the 2016 cycle, of course, when Pennsylvania rewarded Trump with the bounty electoral votes, which carried him to the finish line that year. Mastriano is a distinct candidate. He is riding or running on the COVID-19 era in Pennsylvania. So this was a state where there were many archaic, incoherent restrictions carried out by the Democratic governor, Tom Wolf, in his second term. He's obviously not running again. He's term limited. And then those restrictions in turn were defended by the chief law enforcement officer of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, Mastriano's Democratic opponent in the race. Mastriano is somewhat of a mysterious figure in the sense of we don't know his entire biography. He's not engaging the press, so therefore we're not reading the typical profiles that one is accustomed to reading about any given candidate in a cycle of this kind. But he is a distinct figure, unique in the sense of he is running this campaign where he's engaging the robust grassroots that exist throughout Pennsylvania, where 67 counties, more than half of those are rural, and he's on the ground engaging those voters. He just recently rolled out TV advertising following months of not having spent a dime compared to Shapiro, who is just saturating TV in a state with 6 media markets. But we will see if this works. But in the sense, to describe Mastriano as MAGA, yeah, I mean, he got the Trump endorsement. He was with Trump with his challenges in the 2020 election. But I think Mastriano is a distinct political figure. I don't know if you can compare him to anyone else in this cycle. He really is unique.
So one of the reasons why we like having you around is that like we all think about a state, or really any state like Pennsylvania, from the outside in, but you're really thinking about it from the inside out. Now, I make jokes about all polls being fake, and certainly there's weaknesses in polls, but like by any reasonable metric that fake political experts use, Doug Mastriano doesn't look like the top of the ticket that the Republicans want. I mean, he's polling behind Shapiro by quite a large margin. He doesn't seem to be raising a ton of money or advertising a lot. Maybe I'm embellishing on the Bear case, but again, like, we want to extrapolate this conversation to what's going on in the Senate, to what's going on in some House races and such too. So like, are you willing to say that his brand is beyond those numbers, and he does have some sort of retail politics appeal that we don't understand, and that perhaps it's too soon to count him out?
I think it's worth anyone watching. There's a nonpartisan take on Mastriano in the sense of, does a candidate have raw campaign talent? And my suggestion to anyone would be to watch Mastriano's victory speech from the spring primary where he won. And it's about 20 minutes. You can find it on YouTube. And you're looking at a figure with raw campaign talent. On the ground, to the rural voter, the social conservative who is just livid over this era, who has endured economic hardship, a sense of social ostracism for his or her political viewpoints, living in a rural community that has just been consistently battered for years. To listen to a guy like Mastriano indisputably appeals to that voter, and where Mastriano is tapping in compared to Trump in 2016, Mastriano is tapping into the first-time rural voter who was never necessarily politically engaged. Nevertheless, he is running to the right of the average Trump voter in Pennsylvania. The average Trump voter in Pennsylvania was a lifelong Democrat or from a previously Democratic family, culturally Catholic, socially moderate, or indifferent, and what was just drawn to Trump's message on economics, his position on China, his views on the state of manufacturing in a state where manufacturing was eviscerated over the course of 30 years, and his positions on immigration in a state where there was rapid demographic change over 20 to 30 years of so many post-industrial communities. So the Mastriano message sells to the higher poverty area that's rural. Does that work in a statewide map that's increasingly suburban? That remains to be seen. But all indications would be that, considering the history of Pennsylvania, how it rewards statewide candidates, Shapiro's opening isn't just Greater Philadelphia. It's the suburbs that go beyond Philadelphia, from the Lehigh Valley to South Central Pennsylvania and beyond.
So I want to basically just ask you two more questions before we open this up. And let me remind you, please do mute yourself for this portion. And that question is, it sounds to me like you're saying that Mastriano might be a mixed blessing, in the sense that perhaps in some of these close house races that people are starting to get woke to, like I'm thinking specifically the 7th and the 8th up in Northeast Pennsylvania and like the Scranton Wilkes-Barre area, that perhaps Doug Mastriano might be a blessing for Republicans in districts like that. Whereas if you're Dr. Oz and you're trying to kind of play from behind after a tough primary, and your natural constituency might be in Montgomery County outside of Philadelphia or something like that, that he might be a little bit of a burden. Oh, you're shaking your head. I like it.
No. Dr. Oz, if you look at the primary results, Dr. Oz's base was actually the two congressional districts that you just described. So we were Northeastern Pennsylvania, the Lehigh Valley. He did really well there compared to McCormick, who really carried the rest of the state with a few exceptions, places that were Trump counties that were previously Democrat. Mastriano, the Republican Party in Pennsylvania has confronted challenge after challenge. Its cataclysmic moment was the 2015 state Supreme Court race, where they lost 3 open seats, the highest number in memory. All went Democrat. And then you have this huge field going into the spring primary, completely disorganized, conflicting endorsements, conflicting donors at the state level, and to create this opening for Mastriano, who tapped into that grassroots social media driven rage over the state of affairs in the state going back to 20. But will that help in Northeastern Pennsylvania, Lehigh Valley? I think it's a neutral outcome. If anything, these voters are more inclined to vote for Oz over their disgust with Fetterman's candidacy. They may not love Oz, but they'll vote for Oz because they don't want Fetterman as their U.S. senator. they'll vote for Mastriano too, but I don't think they'll be as inclined to vote for Mastriano. And based on the redistricting, Alex, I mean, the Lehigh Valley Center district, what makes that so competitive and why Republicans have an opening there is that they added Carbon County. Carbon County is this interesting county split between the Lehigh Valley and the Poconos. It was solidly Democrat in the 2010 cycle when Republicans had a great year in Pennsylvania. Now it's Republican. They're all Republican voters. That the addition of that plus a subtraction of the Poconos-driven parts of the district around Monroe County make that a competitive seat for Republicans. And that seat, of course, flipped after Charlie Dent's retirement in 18.
So do you, and I want to ask you about John Fetterman next, and I promise I'll let our listeners ask you some questions. But before we get off of this topic, is there a situation where the Republicans have a great House map this year, but lose these statewide races? Like, is there a situation where they flip either the 7th or the 8th or both, and then they say, oh, tough luck with the 2 statewide seats, or those two horses tethered together here?
It's absolutely a scenario, but I don't. I never bought into. Let's go back to August and all the stories we read about Oz, how Oz was toast. I never bought into that. Thought it was nonsense. Refused to cover it because the reality is that a candidate like Fetterman, he's not. He may say that he's going to those traditionally Trump counties throughout the state, but those voters are not voting for Fetterman. Fetterman's base is where I am in Radnor Township in suburban Philadelphia. It's not in the rural counties, however much he thinks he may be able to successfully engage them and play to the negative messaging that may work among working class voters who are struggling. They're not inclined to vote for a guy like Fetterman. And the reason, Alex, is because the crime crisis, a concern that is topping polls, the crime crisis isn't limited to Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. It's a crisis in Williamsport, Hazleton, Allentown, and Reading, and all the small cities throughout the state where you have voters who were Democrat, but would never imagine voting Democrat, let's say, again, considering the past few years. And that's why you're seeing dramatic voter registration margins that are playing to Republicans' favor statewide. So just based on that alone, the fact that Democrats now just have about a 500,000 voter registration advantage back to where it was in 2000 suggests to me that a candidate like Oz could absolutely squeeze through and survive this race. Mastriano has a bigger challenge, but the congressional races are competitive, especially in Lehigh Valley. Jim Bognet and Matt Cartwright. I mean, Bognet could absolutely pull off. It's the most competitive race there in memory. But of course, he has to confront the reality that Scranton is a militantly Democratic area. And it's one of the, besides Philadelphia, I would say culturally, that's the most loyal Democratic voter base in the state outside Philadelphia.
Great. And so before we open it up, let me just ask, we all follow politics by the rumor and try and get a little deeper into it. But have you seen John Fetterman? Like, how is John Fetterman's health? We're always leery of underestimating John Fetterman, but I'm also leery of underestimating a major health event. So Do you have any insight into that?
Well, I mean, on Twitter or on social media, the Republican Party is certainly tapping into the viral moments that they're sharing that clearly indicate that Fetterman is experiencing problems since his traumatic health episode, the stroke in the spring. There are valid questions of transparency, and it does factor into this race that voters are asking themselves, is this guy up to a 6-year contract? And are there voters out there who will factor in empathy because they're experiencing their own health problems, their own chronic health issues? Sure. So Oz could overplay his hand, but it's a relevant concern considering what all of us can observe just based on Fetterman's own, the appearance that he's had. Now, the big moment will be October 25th when they have the debate. Yeah. That could be a major moment.
Right. Okay. All right. So Oz not dead yet. Fetterman also not dead yet. We spent a lot of time talking about the Republican base. So maybe boys out there, if you're listening, if you want to like get your questions into the queue, don't be shy. But what is, wouldn't we all like to know, what is the Democratic base in Pennsylvania this cycle? I mean, I was, again, as an outsider, surprised to hear that Fetterman is sort of striking out in rural and exurban Pennsylvania. So maybe you could just dwell a little bit on what the Democratic base is going to look like this year, in your opinion.
The Democratic base is comprised of, let's start with the city of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. You have millennial, Gen Z, young professionals living in these cities who are increasingly inclined to vote. And then you enter the suburbs and you have professionals entering middle age who are who are either registered independent and vote Democrat or are in fact registered Democrat. And I think an important thing to know, Alex, is our idea of prosperous suburbia, yes, which is really the base of the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania. That is not limited to Greater Philadelphia and Greater Pittsburgh. So South Central Pennsylvania, for example, the Harrisburg, East Shore, and West Shore, the suburbs of the capital city, they are exploding in growth. They're driven by eds and meds. Cumberland County, which is the western suburb, let's say, of Harrisburg, the West Shore of the Susquehanna River, that is the most prosperous county in the state outside of Chester. What makes this site, up until recently, even in 2016, Pat Toomey was able to pull off what was a competitive race against Katie McGinty. He was able to win re-election that year, in part because he won Chester County, outperformed Trump in what was a historically Republican area, but now is solidly blue. Chester County is not coming back. That is a Democratic county. But so the base of the Democratic Party, well-to-do suburbanites living in eds and meds communities in small cities and towns where the healthcare system is the primary employer. And with I say the two major exceptions besides Pittsburgh and Philadelphia would be Erie, where you have a strong working class Democratic base, and Scranton, where you have the Democratic Party is almost an economic engine there. I mean, people work at you don't get a job at a local law firm in Scranton unless you're a Democrat. I think that's the best way to put it. It's a very parochial Democratic scene. So you still have communities like that. But besides those hyperlocal cultural factors in Pennsylvania, it's really vast suburbia where that's trending blue and continuing to trend blue. And that, of course, can create challenges for the Republican Party in places where they had a lock for decades, if not forever.
Right. Okay, well, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording this. So sorry to those of you out there who are not part of the club. But that's the first thing that's going to happen.